Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, July 17th, 2023. And I think we've all heard the term gerrymandering, but few people know the history behind it and the fact that it was named after Elbridge Gerry, who was vice president under James Madison, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and was born today in history, July 17th, 1744. So on this episode, I want to highlight some of Gerry's views, tell a little bit about that gerrymandering story, and share what he posted, because he was one of the framers at the Philadelphia Convention, but he was one of three people who refused to sign the document. So I'm going to share three of his main reasons why he said we're basically deal breakers. But first of all, to kick this off, hear from Mike Meharry, a blog post that we published by Mike last year on this date in history, I guess. He said Elbridge Gerry was born in Marblehead, Massachusetts. On July 17, 1744, he was educated by private tutors and entered Harvard College at the age of 13. I mean, it wasn't unheard of at that point. He made a fortune as a merchant, and by the late part of that century, was one of the wealthiest men in Massachusetts. Now, that's just a quick highlight of his origin story. But here from the National Constitution Center, an article called The Brusque Maverick, because he wasn't known for really being totally on one side or the other, maybe a little bit more towards the centralizing, a little bit more towards the federalism side on this and that, but I'll get to that in a moment. They say his education at Harvard in the 1760s made him familiar with the English radical Whig country opposition tradition, which was greatly influential to the ideology of the American Revolution. This tradition was based on a deep hatred of centralized power. I think we can get like Cato's letters and Thomas Gordon, I believe, from that tradition as well. Deep hatred of centralized power and a fear of political and financial structures that supported such power as, well, everything we have today. Standing armies, high taxes and debts, and excessive executive authority. If you think about what James Madison said, and something that I've cited so many times in his political observations some years later, he specifically said, war is perhaps the greatest threat to the public liberty. Why? Because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies, and this is off the top of my head. From armies, you get debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. And you can see that from here as well. But they also talked about excessive executive authority. Madison discussed that as well. So here's one of my favorite quotes from Elbridge Gerry. Standing armies are the bane of liberty. So he came out of that same tradition, that same viewpoint. So when the British passed the Stamp Act, and Gerry was young at that point, I'm trying to train myself to say Elbridge Gerry and gerrymandering at the same time because they were pronounced differently with a G or a J. So if I go back and forth on that, it's just, I haven't gotten there yet. So anyways, when the British passed the Stamp Act, he was pretty young. To raise money. They were raising money to pay for a permanent standing army following the French and Indian War. It's no surprise that Elbridge was absolutely opposed. And according to the New England Historical Society, they say his master's thesis at Harvard in 1765, I haven't read this yet, so I was digging around trying to actually find Elbridge Gerry's master's thesis from Harvard. I'm sure it's out there someplace. I just wasn't able to find this and read through it. It might make for an interesting article in and of itself because we've covered so much of the strategy of resisting the empire during the Stamp Act crisis and after that we can use those tools to apply today. But they say his master's thesis in 1765 argued that the colonies should resist the recently passed Stamp Act. And here from Wikipedia, they say that, I'm just going to cover a few more highlights here. He was elected to the Provincial Assembly, which reconstituted itself as the Massachusetts Provincial Congress after British Governor Thomas Gage, the gun grabber, dissolved the body in October 1774. This was an act of nullification because they're saying basically under the coercive acts, we're dissolving this assembly. You're not allowed to meet. And Elbridge and many others were just saying, well, we're going to do it anyways. Elbridge Gerry was assigned to its Committee of Safety, and he was responsible for ensuring that the province's limited supplies and weapons and gunpowder remained out of British Army hands. He had a big part of actually having the storage of weapons and ammunition and gunpowder at Concord, which is exactly where the British marched on Lexington and Concord. So during the war, he was heavily involved in obtaining and building supply lines for the Continental Army. Here's Meharry again. Gerry was elected as a representative to the First Continental Congress, but he declined the position because he was grieving the death of his father. I mean, we got to go through that at some point. He subsequently served in the Second Continental Congress from 1776 until 1780, and he was actually one of the people in the run-up to the Declaration of Independence who was actually really pushing people who were on the fence to get on board because they wanted it to be unanimous. They didn't get any no votes. But everyone who decided to actually vote gave a yes, and Gerry was very influential, and that's what Mike said. His voice was instrumental in convincing some reticent members of that body to support the Declaration of Independence. Here's how John Adams put it in a letter to James Warren just a couple of weeks later, July 15th, 1776. He said, "If every man here was a Gerry, the liberties of America would be safe against the gates of earth and hell." He went on to be a member of the Confederation Congress, but where I think he had the most impact was in the Philadelphia Convention of 1787 and the years to follow. Here's another one of my favorite quotes from him. "The evils we experience flow from the excess of democracy." The idea of two wolves and a sheep. I think we've all heard this. Now, he wasn't necessarily really popular, of course, for taking this kind of view, and I'm going to get into a little bit more of what he discussed and proposed at the Philadelphia Convention here in just a moment. But here from an article called "A Founding Father in Dissent" from the National Archives. They say, because of his fear of demagoguery and belief that the people could be easily misled, he advocated for indirect elections. And he put it this way: the people do not want virtue, but they are the dupes of pretended patriots. I mean, how many times have we heard somebody campaign for office today? They say all kinds of wonderful things. They win their election, and then all of a sudden there's all kinds of excuses as to why they couldn't keep up with those promises. Or it's just dropped, or it's just blamed on the other partisan team. Well, we couldn't do that because they got in the way. And really, this is, I think, a great example of a pretended patriot, and this is part of why Elbridge Gerry was so opposed to direct elections of pretty much anybody. Going further, although he was unsuccessful in obtaining these indirect elections for the House of Representatives, he did obtain such elections for the Senate, whose members were to be elected by the state legislatures. This actually at least kind of allayed some of his fears. He was very concerned about the power of the Senate, though. They say he was also active in supporting an amendment provision. So Article 5, believing that, quote, "the novelty and difficulty of the experiment requires periodical revision." Agreeing, they write, that the convention adopted such a provision. I'm not sure who wrote this article. It's really interesting. Greg Bradsher. I'm going to link to it in the show notes. I'll mention that in just a moment as well. And here from Dave Benner, talking about the origination clause, the process by which revenue bills are raised. They have to be in the House of Representatives. Elbridge actually didn't want the Senate to touch this at all. And this is how Dave describes it. Gerry believed that since the Senate was composed of a relatively small amount of individuals, it would become as an oligarchy that could tax effectually and at will and without regard to the people's recourse. Not too far off there at all. His proposal would have made it impossible for the Senate to amend these revenue bills, since famous nationalists such as James Wilson were disturbed at how far this curtailed the Senate's power. The clause was eventually altered to specify the parameter of revenue bills only. So he really wanted to narrow the Senate's power when it came to money, because he just didn't trust them. He thought it was kind of an oligarchy, and it really has played out like that. Here's how he put it. Taxation and representation are strongly associated in the minds of the people, and they will not agree that any but their immediate representatives shall meddle with their purse. I do like the fact that even though he's saying we're going to have these other people tax you or steal from you, whatever it may be, he still actually refers to it as meddling in your purse. He's no anarchist whatsoever. He's actually more, probably in my mind, a little bit more towards the big government kind of approach on this type of stuff. But still, that's a pretty decent take in comparison to most people today. He looks at taxation even in its best state where he just wanted representatives of the people, still be meddling in your purse. Today, they're saying if you don't like taxes, most people are like, what? You hate America? You want the country to crumble? You don't like infrastructure? You want grandma and grandpa to die? How are we going to get vaccinated? Whatever it may be. National defense, always. If you don't want the government to rip everyone off, you're an enemy of freedom somehow. Anyways, I'm just going off on a tangent here. Back to Elbridge Gerry. In short, he said, the acceptance of the plan, that's the Constitution, will inevitably fail if the Senate be not restrained from originating money bills. He at least got that part in. He really pushed to get the Senate out of originating these types of revenue bills. Now, that hasn't always played out in practice, but that's how it's supposed to be. The final wording of the clause, and this is from Joe Wolverton. I'll link to this in the show notes as well. The final wording of that clause was actually much tamer than what Gerry would have liked. Earlier in the summer, he offered, and this is at the Philadelphia Convention, he offered language that would have prevented the Senate from playing any role in proposing, passing, and imposing revenue bills. He wanted to have them totally hands off. And as I keep mentioning, I'm going to link to these articles, original source documents, and stuff over in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. I publish a blog post for every single episode about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done. And there in each blog, you're going to find a show link section. You're also going to find all the different platforms we're on. You may be watching us or listening to us on one, but one day we just maybe disappeared from that platform. And you want to go to 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty to find all the other places that we put this show, whether it's live streaming on the mainstream ones like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and Twitch and LinkedIn. We also live stream at rumble.com and odyssey.com, loving both of those platforms, giving us more reach, more opportunities for you to choose something else. We also have the audio-only podcast edition all over the place. And while I'm doing this and mentioning this stuff, I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you being here. I hope your Monday's off to a good start. Hope you had an awesome weekend. And whether you're here for your first time or you've been here for every episode since day one, thank you. There's Kirk Morrison. Good to see you in South Carolina. Cheriton Farmer in Missouri. There's Dixie Strong in Bama, Haji in Southeast Michigan, Rick in Michigan, Northeast Michigan. There is Ward Lawrence, Senator DT, John, and everyone else. I know I'm missing a couple of people here, but just trying to scroll through and get back to this. Now, as I mentioned right at the beginning, again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty is where you're going to find the blog post for this episode and all of our archives. So as I mentioned earlier, he was one of only 3 people at the Philadelphia Convention with George Mason and Edmund Randolph who didn't sign the Constitution. I wouldn't necessarily lump him in with the ardent anti-federalists like Patrick Henry, or even more, I guess, a little bit more middle of the road like George Mason, or like Brutus, for example. Brutus may have been a little bit more aggressive. He was far more of a middle ground kind of guy. Again, here from archives.gov, during June, this is of 1787, he did frequently help to check the extreme nationalists by arguing and voting against their motions. He forced them to yield on an absolute veto for the chief executive. Now, if you listen to my episode on the Virginia plan a couple of months ago, I talked about how the original plan coming from James Madison and others would have given not just the executive, but the federal government total veto power, not over anything and anything from Congress, but also of the states. There was a very, very strong push for basically replacing the previous system with a maybe even more powerful version of what they actually got away from. So bad stuff. But Elbridge Gerry actually had kind of a moderating influence on that. He did get them to yield on this absolute veto for the executive and on giving the central government an absolute power to negate state laws. He got them to drop the word national out of the Virginia plan and substitute the phrase the United States. And I mentioned that episode on the Virginia plan. It's a little bit like this one, maybe a little bit more for people who geek out on this type of history, want to really understand these founding principles and the people behind it. But this is the early part of the Philadelphia Convention, the stuff that they proposed. And I think it also kind of sheds some light on why things kind of drifted towards more consolidation after ratification, because there were so many people, and I didn't really get into that episode at all, but I think that is actually kind of a hint, because people really did want centralized power at the time as well. Anyways, he was also a vocal in opposing, this is from Wikipedia, the 3/5 compromise, which counted slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of apportionment in the House of Representatives, whereas counting each slave individually would have given southern slave states a decided advantage. So if the option was between counting them as 1 or as 3/5, then that actually gave the slave power, we can call it, less influence. But if it was 1 versus 0, that's a different question. That's not what I'm trying to discuss today. I just wanted to mention that Gerry opposed slavery. He was a very strong anti-slavery kind of guy. He said the Constitution should have, quote, nothing to do with it, so as to not to sanction it. So he didn't even want that included. He did not win on that one. But he assumed that George Washington would be the first president. This is, again, from Greg or whoever wrote this over at the National Archives. But that did not prevent him from calling for impeachment provisions. He helped push for having impeachment provisions. And he said, a good magistrate will not fear them. A bad one ought to be kept in fear of them. So basically all of them. But unfortunately, we're missing the point that Congress is filled with good guys. That isn't, I mean, if Congress were filled with good guys, every president in my lifetime would have been impeached. And, well, successfully. Because they're nowhere close to keeping their oath to the Constitution. Anyway, he also expressed his hope that, quote, maxim would never be adopted here that the chief magistrate can do no wrong. And agreeing, the convention adopted the impeachment provision. Now, from overall during the Philadelphia Convention, he addressed the convention, I think it was like 150 or 155 times. I can't remember. 130. It was a lot. He was one of the most active people in the Philadelphia Convention. And again, from Greg at National Archives, of all the powers given to the central government, Gerry most feared the military power. And that's why I started out with that quote, or early on, that he called standing armies the bane of liberty. And just like James Madison and so many others, they did not want permanent standing armies because they saw them as so destructive of liberty. He was successful in getting the convention to limit the power of the central government to send military forces into the states. That would have been under the Virginia Plan, basically using force to get the states to get into line if they don't comply with what the central government did. And empowering the chief executive only to make war, but not declare war. So there's declare versus wage, declare versus what. The idea of having the executive branch, according to James Madison and Elbridge Gerry and others, being able to make that decision, that was the British system. They didn't want a single person to be able to make that decision because it would encourage it to happen more and more and more. So they wanted to separate that between the representatives of the people in the states and the executive branch. Once the representatives of the people and the representatives of the states made the decision that the country was going to change its state of things from peace to war against another country, then it would be up to the executive branch to take care of waging that war. He also successfully fought off attempts by the nationalists to give the central government total control over the state militias. He was, however, unsuccessful in preventing a peacetime standing army. He was one of the, there was a pretty decent number of people who were actually opposing any type of standing army during peace, not like a 2-year funding type of thing. He didn't actually get that. And he also wanted to limit the peacetime army, if they were going to have it, to no more than 3,000 soldiers. And that did not play out. He also warned that the judicial department was going to be, what he said, oppressive, and supported the right of trial by jury. And this is part of why he was big on pushing for a Bill of Rights. Part of his objections actually encouraged the proposed amendments in the Massachusetts ratifying convention in the following January, February of 1788. This was the first state that when they ratified, they said, we're ratifying, but we also want a bunch of amendments. And the first of the amendments that they recommended was basically a precursor to the 10th Amendment. Thomas Jefferson said he originally wanted 9 states to approve the document and 4 to reject it to force some amendments. But then once he saw the Massachusetts plan from Hancock, Gerry, and others, he said, I think that's the best approach at this point. We should recommend amendments. That's what they did in Virginia and elsewhere. So he supported trial by jury as a defense against bad judges, because if you can declare someone not guilty, or you say that the law is unjust and so you vote to acquit, then it doesn't matter how bad the judge is because the jury has the final say. Juries are necessary, he said, to guard against corrupt judges. Right after that, and I think this was on September 12th, 1787, so as we're closing out the Philadelphia Convention, he actually immediately, so there was a little bit of back and forth there, and then he went and made the motion to generate a committee to prepare a Bill of Rights. He was one of the people that wanted to have a Bill of Rights attached to the Constitution before it was actually sent to the states for ratification. George Mason seconded that one. It failed by a vote of 5-5. Massachusetts abstained, so he wasn't able to convince the entire delegation there in Massachusetts to actually vote and get a win, 6-5. So that one failed. There was another attempt to do something like that. So after it left the Philadelphia Convention, a quick side note, they sent the proposed Constitution to the Confederation Congress, where Richard Henry Lee kind of picked up the torch there and really started pushing to add a Bill of Rights in advance. So that was Elbridge Gerry failing to get a Bill of Rights attached before ratification debates. Now, he actually listed out 11 total objections on the 15th of September. We know Constitution Day, September 17th, that's the day that the Philadelphia Convention wrapped up. And on the 15th, he gave a short speech discussing his 11 bullet-pointed issues that he had with the Constitution. 8 of them, he said, I can kind of deal with this basically if we get a Bill of Rights. But these 3 are deal breakers. I'm going to link to this in the show notes so you can read through them. I just want to go through the 3 deal breakers. He said, 1, the general power of the legislature to make what laws they may please to call necessary and proper. So Elbridge Gerry said the necessary and proper clause, as it was structured, was a deal breaker. He could not get on board with supporting the Constitution, supporting ratification, as long as there was this necessary and proper clause. 2, the power to raise armies and money without limit. Of course, some people argued that they don't have unlimited power, but Hamilton and others, Hamilton and Federalist Papers and others later on during the ratification debate said, well, of course it's unlimited power. Gerry warned against that. And today we see how that plays out so many times over and over and over. History does not always repeat, but it certainly rhymes. And number 3, to establish a tribunal without juries, which will be a star chamber as to civil cases. He said, under such a view of the Constitution, the best that could be done, he conceived, was to provide for a second general convention. That was on September 15th, 1787. I will link to that in the show notes. Now, let's quick discuss the gerrymander, not the Gerry-Mander. It was first drawn on a map and signed into law February 11th, 1812, by Elbridge Gerry, who was the governor of Massachusetts. He really wanted to be in office. He ran like 4 times, failed. He finally got in. It was a pretty acrimonious, pretty partisan debate. He ended up winning. He signed into law a redistricting plan designed to keep his political party, the Democratic Republicans, in power in the upcoming election. So this was one of his final acts as governor. And most historians, everywhere you look this up, whether it's Wikipedia or elsewhere, almost all of them say that Gerry was actually opposed to the practice. He did not like the redistricting plan, but he signed it anyways. He was somehow convinced. But the only actual real source, I have not seen anything in his writing. Now, I'm not an expert on all of his writing, but where I found something discussing this is that it was according to his son-in-law. He thought, quote, this was a highly disagreeable plan. So he may have told his family, he may have said it in private, he may have discussed it as highly disagreeable, but he certainly did it anyway. This was part of his second term as governor. The first one, he was kind of a middle ground guy, but once his team gained control of the legislature, he started moving towards more partisan moves, and that's just what happens. And the interesting thing is the term gerrymandering is a portmanteau, and I'm not sure, my French is usually probably pretty bad. It's a portmanteau, so a combination of 2 words, of a salamander and Elbridge Gerry, who was vice president of the United States at the time of his death, who as governor of Massachusetts in 1812, signed a bill that created a partisan district in the Boston area that was compared to the shape of a mythological salamander. The term, according to Wikipedia, has negative connotations, and gerrymandering is almost always considered a corruption of the democratic process. So it was used for that first time in the Boston Gazette, which was years earlier. It was the mouthpiece. It was the publication of the Sons of Liberty, and was published on March 26, 1812. Now, historians widely believe that the Federalist newspaper editors like Nathan Hale and Benjamin and John Russell came up with the term, but there's no certain. It was actually Gerry-Mander, and over the years it's become gerrymander, a single word. And this is an interesting closeout from the New England Historical Society. They say Elbridge Gerry didn't deserve to have his name forever linked with political trickery. Yes and no. I mean, I guess ultimately you have to be responsible for your actions. Now, if he signed something, if you look at the image of this thing, it's funny how, I mean, I'll link to it in the show notes so you can see the image. This first newspaper publication, it's like this crazy, I guess, whatever you want to call it, this mythological salamander that's going to come and destroy people. But the way that they redistricted it was pretty wild, and it certainly gave an advantage to his team. And now this is just kind of part of the political process. I guess if he hadn't done it, someone else probably would have over time. And so maybe that's their view, but he didn't. They say that he didn't deserve to have his name forever linked with it, but it was a pretty fascinating political cartoon. It was pushed and it had been out there quite a bit, and it caught on. So the market wins on that one. But during his lifetime, they say he had a reputation for integrity, as best as a politician can have, right? He stood on principle, even if it cost him. Although, if he was opposed to this plan, he signed it anyways, that's not standing on principle. I would disagree with that. His shrewd business sense and logistical acumen were indispensable to the revolutionary cause. Absolutely true. He knew how to keep New Englanders and the military supplied, an oft overlooked key to the American victory in the War for Independence. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. It's not my usual topic, but every now and then I like to do one of these things discussing a forgotten founder, a forgotten framer that isn't discussed in the government-run school systems. They never want to teach us these things. So I hope you found this interesting. I hope it was educational. And if you want to help us get this kind of historical information out, plus all the things that we do on the ground today to stand for the Constitution and liberty when government refuses to do its job, which is, well, constantly, 24/7, 365. Absolutely nothing helps us get that job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. Throw us a couple of dollars of that dirty government fiat over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, and we will use it for supporting liberty. While I'm here, I'm going to take a quick look in the live chat, see if there's any comments or questions I can get back to. Just scrolling through here. Seeing a little bit back. Oh, hi, Doug Fox and Cracker Jacks. I appreciate you guys being here. I don't see any comments that I can get back to right now, but I'll read through them in a little bit more detail later today or tomorrow. You can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com, all spelled out, if you've got suggestions for the show, comments or questions. I rarely am able to find time to get back to people, but I do read through everything, and it gives me a lot of ideas for future episodes. If you call me out, I'm missing something, getting something wrong, or I didn't dive deep into something, or I wasn't clear, or you just have some unrelated topic that you think I should cover, leave it in the comments, especially in the archive on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, and elsewhere, or send an email. And I absolutely appreciate you watching. I appreciate you listening. I hope you had a great weekend. I hope your Monday's off to a good start, and I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty.